Halo has always, at least partially, been a product of its community.
While it was by no means the first online multiplayer experience to explode into the mainstream, it was maybe the first to not be occupied by your high school bullies that were a little too into D&D and Iron Maiden.
Halo was accessible, not simplistic or minimalistic, but terse in its design language. If I was in the business of making big, useless statements designed for box covers with no sense of irony, I might go as far as calling it the Tetris of shooters. What Bungie created was a puddle as deep as an ocean, with more story than your average porn film and at least the same gameplay depth as your run-of-the-mill Valve shooter. And naturally, that creates one hell of a powerful fan base. Halo's community turned players into fans, and fans into entertainment juggernauts. Bolstered by the newly minted Xbox Live, Halo 1 and 2 exploded into the killer apps of Microsoft's home console efforts. To say that Halo fever was in full swing in the early 2000s would be an understatement. On the PC, however, things were a tad different. On the back of its immensely successful Warcraft series, Blizzard had launched World of Warcraft, the fastest-selling PC game of all time. It was something massive, not only in its ability to create a multiplayer role-playing experience, but also in the efforts required to maintain it. What we have on our hands is a crossroads, a blending of the two. This is the story of how Microsoft was poised to take its flagship against Blizzard, and how it sank at sea. This is the story of Titan, the Halo MMO that never was. Ensemble Studios made two things, Age of Empires and canceled prototypes. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. Part of what Ensemble did was compete with Blizzard, and they were at least pretty good at it when it came to the Warcraft franchise. That doesn't mean they weren't on unsure footing, however. As of 2004, they'd released 4 games, all but one of them having titles that started with Age of, and 2 of those ended with Empires. Some would call that job security, but others at the studio saw it as a creative rut. In order to get back on track, out of a rut, and into a metaphor that works a little better, they cleaned their slate and looked towards working on games they wanted to make. In 2004, they started on 3 prototypes. Nova, a Diablo-style action RPG that definitely never came out. Phoenix, a console RTS aspiring to be the first of its kind. And Titan, an MMO designed to compete with World of Warcraft. As far as I can tell, these all started as original IPs. Jason Schreier's book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, which did a wonderful job of filling in the gaps at Ensemble around this time, talks about Phoenix featuring a War of the Worlds-inspired setting, involving humans being greatly outmatched by an alien threat. But Ensemble was owned by Microsoft, and Microsoft was on the cusp of their famous Xbox 360 launch where nothing bad happened at all. And when they saw the console RTS, they loved it, but insisted it had to be Halo. Putting that much effort into a new IP on a new console for a niche genre making the jump to the controller for the first time, it was a pretty damn big risk. Adding the Covenant and Spartans and that choir intro that makes grown men nostalgic for sleepover LAN parties made it less of one. So Ensemble titled their game Halo Wars and started pairing up with Bungie to fill out the world. Schreier's book also makes it sound like the MMO team slapped the Halo title onto Titan well after Halo Wars was in full swing, and shortly before it was cancelled. But I kind of don't buy it. During that time, and even to this day, it's kind of uncommon for MMOs to be entirely new franchises. Being so heavily inspired by World of Warcraft and being die-hard MMO fans, they'd likely already know that. It wasn't too long before this that Microsoft had ended support of Allegiance, a failed, not quite massive multiplayer online game that basically nobody played. And the idea of Ensemble pitching something similar without some form of already established brand goodwill doesn't feel super likely. Even my own experiences dabbling in MMOs over the years have been exclusively in franchises that I enjoy. And the ones I haven't jumped into, like, well, World of Warcraft, is largely because I'm intimidated by the long-standing lore that's already there. However, Halo, like Warcraft at the time, was only really 2 games and a couple of books. making it just enough lore to get people interested with room to grow in a really cool way, while filling out part of the story far enough away from the main games that it has less to worry about. That's exactly what Titan wanted to do in its narrative, at least as far as I can tell. Halopedia claims that Titan was going to be set in the Age of the Forerunners, on a single Halo ring millions of years before the events of combat evolved. But when checking the source, which kids, you should always do, we only really have one thing that confirms that, a tweet from a developer in 2018. I'm not doubting them. I mean, they literally worked on the game that I'm trying to piece together, but a lot of the concept art feels at least somewhat in the current Halo timeline. Because I'm in the business of trusting offhanded Twitter comments and have spent plenty of time watching science fiction canon develop in real time, I'm actually gonna assume both are true, and that the primordial Age of the Forerunner humans, which would be fleshed out more in later books and games, were, for the sake of this MMO, functionally identical to the humans of the original Halo trilogy, their love of green armor and vehicles named after animals and all. Like the Old Republic would do about 8 years later, this gave Ensemble the sort of blue sky period necessary to tell a wide range of stories without having people ask where the big main players were, while still allowing them to maintain what people liked about the franchise. Halo wouldn't really be Halo without green armor and the Covenant and that chorus that makes grown men nostalgic for LAN parties in 2010. But on the other hand, at least some of the leaked concept art has been met with hesitation in the Halo community. While I'd agree that some of this is much more fantasy focused than the military sci-fi charm of the main games, I think it's interesting to see what a non-Bungie studio would do with the franchise at this time. That included a faction system similar to World of Warcraft, including not only those Forerunner humans, but an early version of the Covenant that were, as Ensemble's director of technology Dave Pottinger put it, weren't the Covenant just yet, as well as a handful of others involving a wide range of species. This really paints a picture of a canon in flux, a sort of snapshot of the first 3-ish games, which quiets basically any and all hesitations I have as a fan of the Halo aesthetic. We're looking at two different, incomplete pictures. What also helps to quiet that hesitation is that while Ensemble was working on Halo Wars at the same time, Joe Staten was called in to assist with writing. He's perhaps best known for being the main writer of the original 3 Halo games and Contact Harvest, one of the books on my Goodreads to be read list. While Bungie was notably not thrilled to have another studio playing in their sandbox, Staten provided a little more legitimacy to Halo Wars, and it's safe to assume that he was at least somewhat involved in developing Titan into what it was as well. Regardless, what we see in the concept art is a wide range of factions and characters utilizing what senior software engineer Dusty Monk called a heroic stylized art style that was once again compared to the Old Republic, which he calls timeless. As a result of this, we get a more complex look at the Halo universe beyond just focusing on humanity's struggles with the Covenant. And as former RTS developers, that seems pretty on par to what they've done, and relatively similar to how Blizzard transferred the Warcraft mythos into its own MMO, but still impressive as this isn't Ensemble's own IP. Additionally, this interview with Dusty and a few others illustrate a more action-focused environment. A cover system once again similar to what we'd see with the Old Republic, and quests involving uniting a wide range of factions. There's also a handful of references to the Flood, and so when I hear quests involving multiple factions, I picture a chunk of a Halo ring being a sort of PvP environment involving infected players, something that feels like an homage to not only the multiplayer infection mode that was all the rage in Halo 2 and 3, but also the corrupted blood incident that was tearing through World of Warcraft during Titan's development. What we have then is a great cross-section of something that's MMO-y enough to take on the likes of WoW, but action-focused enough to capture Halo fans, with enough innovation to separate itself from both and to keep it relevant for the 8 or so years before the Old Republic is released. So then why was it cancelled? At least part of it is due to a big change-up with Microsoft's goals. As far as I can tell, and judging by the trends of the era, this was a PC game, focused directly on mouse and keyboard input, and well, Microsoft didn't really do much of that anymore. If you were to take a look at games that were published in this era by Microsoft, very few were exclusive to PC, unless they were an RTS, something that Ensemble was directly addressing with Halo Wars, and like Flight Simulator. Even if it was coming to the 360, their online presence was very much focused on Xbox Live, something that included voice chat as a selling point. Before this, console MMOs like, say, Phantasy Star Online featured unwieldy controllers that I have eBay alerts on for, and while that would probably be fine, it's hard to have your franchise that encourages voice commands, player inputs, and let's call them personality-driven team matchups being forced to rely on text chat. So then just add voice chat, you say. Well, they'd already tried with future Yokai Watch developer Level 5's own attempt at a Microsoft-published MMO, True Fantasy Live Online, that ran into massive struggles with getting their own version of voice chat implemented. It was kind of a mess to do at the time. Console MMOs were a rarity, and unfortunately, Microsoft was moving its gamer eggs to the console basket. That's at least mostly speculation on my part, but what isn't is Dusty Monk's own testament to how Microsoft was shifting towards a more casual audience after witnessing the success of the Wii, which made sense considering the $90 million budget some sources say Titan had, putting it on the low side for a game that Microsoft would have to pay even more to maintain, in an environment and company that was really shifting away from that style. Additionally, at this time, Microsoft was frustrated with Ensemble as they pushed the studio to actually finish Halo Wars, instead of focusing on their other prototypes like Titan, which had larger teams than the RTS. And as a result, would lead to Microsoft moving to close down Ensemble at the end of the development of Halo Wars, ending any hopes of Titan seeing the light of day, and any hope of Ensemble being something other than an RTS developer. Their opportunity to change into something to compete with what Blizzard had become had gone by the wayside for a comfortable familiar. I suspected that a lot of this team would scatter into the wind and probably end up at BioWare Austin where they'd work on the Old Republic. There were way too many similarities for this to be a coincidence. Between the announcement of the studio closing and when Halo Wars was launched, only 3 people left. And as a result, the credits for Halo Wars listed on MobyGames.com probably provides the most complete list of people at the studio at the time that I would be able to find. But as far as I can tell, nobody ended up at BioWare working on the Old Republic or any other BioWare game, which was a bit of a surprise. A variety of people would end up at Robot Entertainment, the new studio under Microsoft that continued the Age of Empires series. People like Dusty Monk would go on to form their own studios, and even more would naturally end up at Blizzard, including some notable figures in World of Warcraft forum posts and, federal investigations. Halo would certainly see its ups and downs as Bungie would push outwards towards Destiny, with its own take on a more MMO-focused sci-fi adventure.
While I'm not one to say that the closing of a studio with a pedigree like Ensemble is ever a net positive, especially when it was in the midst of taking massive risks, it's interesting to see how a cancelled MMO showed where Halo, Bungie, and Microsoft's future plans lied, and how that terse simplicity in game design proved effective in not only gaining new audiences in the rise of the casual era, but also in how massively multiplayer games would move forward in an era beyond World of Warcraft.